Hi everyone. So this is number 6 in the series, and as you can see, this one's being recorded during the lockdown. So I'm in the basement of my house at home because 7 of us live in here, and most of us are working from home. So I've drawn the short straw. Linda's got a much nicer place.
I'm in my apartment with 4 people and no outdoor area. So I think we're equal here. So we've got 4 people in a very small apartment. And I'm locked into one of the rooms, and we actually negotiate for time on private space for Zoom
Yeah.
meetings. Yeah.
And
So
it
there
is
you go.
important. It is important that we all look after each other by not even though I could be on my own in Metropolis. But
No, keep the bubble tight
yeah,
and don't burst it. Yep.
yeah.
Okay. We're on. Um,
So
where
in
do we
this one, yesterday we had an overview where we talked about focused again on the stages of the job, because several of the people who are in the course now weren't at the School of Architecture last year. So we focused on the stages of the job in New Zealand, and now we're looking at the actual contract between the architect and the client.
And one of this is, as you know, from number 5, the architecture NZRAB, we obviously need to have a terms of an appointment as one of our basic code of ethics. And here's an example of when architects are disciplined for not having a terms of employment. So today's focus is just looking a little bit more detail on what does that mean? What is the term of employment? The agreement for architect services.
And we were having a bit of a discussion about this before, because it's still okay to go and have a look at the client's site. It might be a house alteration, it might be an empty patch of land, and to kind of have a conversation about it, and even sketch a few things. But
Yes.
you can still do that.
So the term of employment doesn't have to be from day one. Sometimes there's a kind of an easing into this relationship that you're going to have with your client, and that easing in, as Bill said, you could actually be talking on site. You can even provide a bit of concept design, because really they could take off with it without paying you anything if there's no AAS already in place. But it's not going to be that much help to them, because, as you know, design is not a singular thing. It gets developed over time. So sometimes this period before the agreement is signed can stretch out to a few weeks. But I guess our message is, don't leave it too long. So you've got to find that spot where you both trust each other.
And again,
sorry, Bill, you go.
We were talking about ethics last time, and ethics are covered much more thoroughly in one of the earlier handouts, number 3, I think it is. I'm pretty sure it is, because that's registration of the architect. And you also see references to it occurring in 4 and then all the way through, because they are really important. And what ethics are doing, you can see kind of a lot of the things on here are really just about being a decent person. And the Prime Minister in these strange times at the moment is telling us all to be kind to each other, number 1, and then staying at home in our bubble. But there are other things that we're doing here to kind of protect the profession as well. So when you're a young person, and hungry for work, trying to get a job, you might be tempted to cut fees, but kind of in the long term, that's not very healthy for the profession and the people that you will be employing. And when you end up having a family and you need to go to the supermarket and things like that, you find you're not earning as much as you did, because everyone's been cost cutting.
So it's about being collegial and supporting rather than undercutting there. There's also an ethical thing around the renegotiating of contract terms. You can't renegotiate a contract once it has been signed for obvious legal reasons, but also it falls into an ethical reason. You can't suddenly say, well, actually, I'm not going to provide that anymore. Another one down there too is interesting, not maintaining confidentiality where required.
Yeah.
So we're just thinking of an example of that, which is sometimes you might get a client where their confidentiality is really, really important, and they ask you not to publish the work that you're going to do for them ever.
Even though it's an amazing design.
Yes, award-winning designs all the time are never published, and usually it comes down to this request for confidentiality. So that's just an example of where it may apply, but also it extends to basic ethics of not sharing information from a client to your friends, or out beyond an architectural circle. So you end up being privy to clients' private lives and information, so you obviously can't share that.
And you have to be professional, and you don't go home and gossip about it with your family, or gossip about it when you're having drinks with friends.
Yes. So these are just some of the examples when it comes to ethics. And number 5, we showed you a document called Keeping Out of Trouble with Your Clients. So this is just an example of the, again, the fee agreement, and the fact that it's so important, how important it is. We're just reminding you again that it's required, but it's also really important, and that what to spell out in that fee agreement.
So on the first page of the handout, and again, kind of like when Linda and I do these podcasts, as we're doing now, rather than lectures, where we give you a general overview in relation to the PowerPoint, and that reflects that. But for the detail, go through the handout, which is in a separate PDF that you get off Canvas. This guide to better agreements for services for architects comes from the NZACS, and they are the people that architects go to for insurance, for to protect them, and it's compulsory to have insurance when you're a registered architect and practicing. And they've got some very good key points in here that are on the front page of the handout and are really worth having a look at.
And so the insurance Bill's talking about there is professional indemnity insurance. So that is separate than the actual project. So we're not talking now about insurance for the actual construction of the project. This is to protect the architect against any liabilities that may come across them in the future. So the architect is insured constantly. Doesn't matter if they're working or not. So that's the first thing. So the PI insurance is tied to the architect's services, not tied to any particular project. That separation is important. So for those of you that did the assignment last year, you'll remember that when we talked about insurances, it only related to the client and the contractor. And that's because the architect's insurance for their services is completely separate, and they weren't privy to that contract between the client and the contract. So here we see that architects are covered by a PI insurance company.
And from that same one, here's an overview of the contract. We won't go into detail on that, but just a reminder that a contract, and we went through this last year quite thoroughly, and again, you people that weren't at Auckland last year, we will be giving you a copy of all those handouts. But a contract is an offer, an acceptance, and it must have consideration, which is generally money or some sort of consideration, barter or something like that, has to be part of a contract.
Yep. Often clients will want to set up their own contract with the architect, and the NZIA advice is obviously to use the NZIA AAS short form of contract. But clients will say, hey, I've got my lawyer, and we've set up a contract to use. Be very, very wary if this is the case, because it can affect your professional indemnity insurance. If you use another contract, suddenly your insurance might be void.
And you can see the top one, adjectives, That's a very good example. We only have to have a reasonable standard of care. That's the standard that we're held to. Whereas if your client generates the contract, they'll be going, we want you to do an outstandingly brilliant job and perform at the very highest level. Well, can you live up to that when you've got all sorts of other jobs that you're working on at the moment, or all sorts of other issues that you're dealing with? And as Linda said, the moment you enter into this, it can affect your personal insurance. So if you get in trouble then you have to you get sued, you have to find $100,000 or something like that. You're selling your car, your house, those sorts of things that your family are in.
So this is just a really good guide of, you know, making sure that you don't get into trouble in these ways that obviously they know about these because it's happened so many times in the past.
Okay, here we go. Into the contract. And as we talked about last year, it's important to remember that contracts sound spooky, but you always enter into contracts every day. When you buy a cup of coffee or get on a bus, you're actually entering into a contract there. There's the offer, there's the acceptance, and there's the money that changes hands there generally. So there are two forms of New Zealand Institute of Architect agreements for architect services. That's the contract between the architect and the client, not between the client and the builder. And there's a big thick one and there's a slightly thinner one. And you can see different dates on both of them. And there are occasionally different dates in the handouts because these things are updated constantly, but the general principles remain the same, pretty much the same.
And that's a really good reminder that when you're in practice to constantly check for the updated versions of everything. So sometimes you can get into trouble if you've used the wrong form. So that's why we keep showing you the different kind of editions here. There's the standard edition, which is 23 pages long, as you can see, and that would apply for most contracts. However, on the other side, the 11 pages version is called the short form agreement. So SAF for short. Yeah. And that is more applied to things like housing or any residential or smaller. But if you were working on a library or a school of any substantial size, you would be using the other agreement generally. Also, if you're working on a complicated, large residential house, it's house or houses, you would be using the bigger form. Yeah. So it's not just because it's residential, it's more about complexity and size of the project.
And here's the beginning of it. And again, you can see a different date up there. Don't worry about it. Don't worry what edition it is. We're just giving you the overview. And sometimes, as we said in the previous podcast, number 5, we show you really early stuff that's got some interesting things in there that you wouldn't say these days. This first page, pretty straightforward. Who's the client? Where's the site? What's the scope of services? New house or a house alteration, and then a covering letter.
Yeah.
And
no, you go, Bill.
We had a bit of conversation about this when we were prepping for this, didn't we? And this is looks to me like a covering letter, but it also kind of appears that it replicates a whole lot of sections of the contract. And number 3 that you can see there, foodstuffs roll, they've written the name of the client in there. It's for a supermarket rather than just client's role. And I'd be a little bit careful about going into that level of detail these days. You want to stick to the standard contract that a whole bunch of lawyers have gone through rather than replicating it and tweaking it too much.
Yeah, so it comes back to that comment earlier about your professional indemnity insurance might be affected if you start actually tweaking the contract with specific changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is pretty straightforward though. This is the schedule that goes with the contract, and this is just where you're putting into a table your fees, and down the bottom, I think that's quite good. You're more of the practitioner, Linda, but that cash flow is a very good idea.
Yeah, so the fee calculation is with the anticipated cash flow is really excellent. I know that we've talked about this earlier in relation to the client paying for the full construction of the building, but it also applies to your fees. They don't want to pay $2,000 one month and then the next one might be $8,000 or $15,000. So they want warning of that. This example here, though, is actually quite consistent. There's not a great jump, but there can be between different stages really big jumps in the cash flow, and your client needs to understand how to manage their cash flow so that you can get paid. So it's a really good example to do that, and to anticipate timing, so that break it down into monthly timing. But, at the top there with fees, it's interesting that you can see the example with the landlord and the operator having, so there are actually two people here in this example paying the bills. So the architect's fees are split between the landlord and whoever is moving in to that space, and they're obviously taking 35% of the load right from the early days with the architect, not just once they rent. So
and with this as well, it's that supermarket job again, and I'm not certain, but the landlord could be either foodstuffs if they were buying the site and building the building and owning it, or it could be someone completely different. It could be a commercial developer, and the operator could either be a franchisee of foodstuffs, or it could be foodstuffs themselves. So it's a little bit unclear to us, but it would be clear to the parties to the contract.
Yes. And obviously we have mentioned earlier again, the timing is quite important for all parties to be aware of. So the architect and the client need to discuss this kind of duration of the services, so everyone's under the same impression, and you don't suddenly get absurd deadlines put on you at the end.
Yeah, and you can see the word target in that second paragraph there as well. So it's not come hell or high water, because things
happen,
such as we're going through at the moment, happen. And even though we're all working from home, they can affect the delivery of the job.
Yeah, so things happen in life. Everyone knows that, and so it's a target.
And then it's nice to have a break from looking at pages of the contract. So these are all kind of like award-winning architectural jobs, but they all worked in different ways within the contract, the Standard Institute contract, the Agreement for Architectural Services.
Yes, so while they all use the AAS as per the NZIA AAS, the examples here are the architect charged by the hour on all of these clients, on all of these projects, which falls within the AAS, but it's not usually recommended. Usually we get a percentage breakdown of fees. So it's just really interesting to know why. Various examples, the one on the top right there, the architect is the client themselves. So the AAS took a very short form because the contract was the same person on both sides.
Yeah, and you might, and that's Ken Crossan's E-type house, and Ken, that's a house for Ken and his family, but it's going through Ken.
RTA, Richard Nash.
Oh, Richard Nash,
yeah.
But it's going through Richard's business, RTA.
Yes. So that's the interesting thing is that the AAS still had to exist. It's like, why would you have a contract with yourself? And as Bill's pointing out, it's actually the architectural company is having a contract with one of the principals of that company. So these are things that you end up working out. The one on the top left is Dave Strawn. That's a picture of his parents. So he didn't have the full AAS in place, again, he did an hourly charge with his own parent. Again, it's usually because the family is a client. That's a reason for this change. Some architects operate like this completely, charge hourly, and that's because of the bespoke nature and the unforeseen nature in the type of work they do. So Michael O'Sullivan on the bottom left and Herbst Architects on the bottom right are both examples of that, where their work is highly attuned to the process itself, and therefore the clients accept that there will be an hourly charge rather than a lump sum or a percentage charge. So there's flexibility within the AAS, but the important thing is you don't rewrite the AAS itself. That's the point that we're trying to share with you there.
So now we're just going to have a closer look at the AAS, the Agreement for Architect Services.
Short one though.
Yeah, the short one, because again, it's got those key points in there, and we just want you to get an overview rather than get bogged down in too much detail.
So the first section is just, as to be expected, the confirmation of the agreement. So all the details of all parties recorded.
And then the scope of the work, you know, is it a small alteration or a big alteration? Is it a new house? Is it a commercial building? Is it an institutional building? What kind of institutional building is it? So on. And you can see it.
And you'll see there the stages are as we discussed in podcast 5. So you've got the pre-design, concept design, preliminary design, and then develop design. And the architect and the client can go down and tick these boxes of what actually the architect will be carrying out, what the client would like the architect to carry out.
Yeah.
So in the previous number 5, I showed an example of my version of that, which was a one-pager, and there were only, there were far less boxes to tick. And that's what I was trying to explain, that in the contract, it's actually quite detailed. And for a client, when you're first discussing it, that can actually be quite a scary thing to sort of take on. So my version is the one-pager first, and then we break it down into detail as the trust builds between the architect and the client. But it's really important because, you end up with a client saying, I only want to engage you for concept design. And then a few months later, you get a call back saying, but where's the color schedule or the paint finishes chart? And it's like, well, actually, that doesn't fall in concept design. That falls in detailed design, or developed design. So you need to, there's lots of these conversations explaining this.
And here's turning the page. This is the second half of the contract. And it detailed design and documentation, so that means drawings for building consent from the council, plus what the builder will use to build the building. And then we've got those sections, contractor procurement, and then contract administration and observation. And it may be that you do none of that, that you don't agree on those. And we talked a little bit about that yesterday. In 5.
So for example, your client might be a project manager themselves and they want to handle the contractor procurement themselves, or there may be a contractor already engaged. So that section is not needed at all. So sometimes that whole section of the contractor procurement just gets avoided by the client. Another example is if you're doing a public building like a library, and contract procurement is handled by the council, so it's never handled by the architect. They don't give you that bit of work, so the whole bit just doesn't get ticked. And another example of contract administration is that it might be handled by a project manager and not by you, but you might be engaged for observation. So this is again the point of clarity needs to be made. These can change, so you can actually, at the point of signing the AAS, you can add in there that these are to be confirmed as the project progresses. Quite often what happens is the client will say, no, we don't want you to do the procurement or the administration or observation, and you only sign up for the first half, and then you get to the end of that and they say, oh, actually, could you do the observation and administration after all? So that's because the trust will have built by then, and it didn't. The prospect doesn't seem so scary for the client.
And we'll just briefly talk about fees here, but the next one that we do, number 7, that's all about fees.
So no detail here, but you can see there that the interesting bit on that page is that once you filled in all your fees up the top, that down the bottom, number 4, consultants, the NZIA recommends that all the required consultants are engaged as separate consultants, i.e. outside of the scope of this contract. But if there are consultants that are engaged within the contract, then they should be listed quite clearly in that position there. And our recommendation is just don't do it.
Yeah, and the technical terms there are, if there are consultants here within the contract, they're sub-consultants, and you, the client pays you and you pay them. You really don't want to get that involved in finances. So still having consultants, but outside this contract, they're still consultants on the project, but they have a separate contract with the client, and the client pays them directly, even though we're liaising with them on the project. Much cleaner.
Yes, much cleaner, and that's often part of what you'll be doing at the start of a project, is helping the client set up those separate contracts with the engineer and with the arborist and with the geotechnical engineer or something like that. So you're just advising them on those separate contracts. The client ends up with quite a few contracts, and it's better than running it through the architect's contract. And the reason we're saying that is in the old days, that's how it was always done, but it's not the old days anymore, and we keep them all separate.
Yeah.
For the protection of all parties, I think.
And now we're at the fine print. So the general conditions are really kind of, you do not touch them. A lot of experience, a lot of legal advice has gone into generating these general conditions. So you wouldn't, you can, in a contract, you could take a pen and strike out any of those, and you and the client would both sign it. But it's not recommended at all. So occasionally you do get a client reading through that and saying, oh, hold on, you know, I don't really think we should agree on that. Be very, very careful about changing anything in general conditions.
And you can, at that point, even email the NZIA, and they have a lawyer there who would advise you on that. If you have a client who's quite pushy about the change, you can actually go there for support, and they'll give you a legal response to that.
Oh, and yeah, and this is an example. So on the left-hand side, and again, back in 2007 for a reason, on the left-hand side, we've got what we've been through, which is kind of, you know, the fairly standard kind of contract, but probably about 10, 15 years ago, a new way of contracting on big jobs, big commercial jobs came in, and that was novation. And that means that you could start off with working on one side of having one relationship with, say, a builder, you know, the traditional architect-builder relationship, and then you could turn around in the middle of a big job and end up working for the builder.
Yes, how else can we explain a novated contract? They're quite complicated, because halfway through the job, the client changes completely, but the contract transfers from client to client.
And we don't really go into it in any detail because it's such a complex area. And really, it's really only the big firms, you know, Warren and Marnie, I know, Jasmax, they are frequently novated in contracts because they're working on very, very big projects.
Yeah.
But
and apparently the core of the problem with Fletcher's has been this difficulties around novated contracts.
On the convention centre.
And others.
On Christchurch.
And housing.
This is something that you will learn about when you're getting your years of experience, and you'll be hearing it straight from the people that are very much involved in that.
Yeah, so effectively you might think that you've got one client, which is, say, the Westpac Bank, and they will start, and you will get all the way through to about to get building consents and all the other consents in place, and effectively somebody else buys that contract from Westpac and they become your new client. So the contract changes. It doesn't get stopped and then started again. It morphs into a new contract that's called novation. That's the essence of it. What it means is your responsibilities under the contract do continue, but now you have an entirely new entirely new client, and generally they're the contractor, the developer, that are going to be doing the building, and they suddenly become your client as well as the developer. So this is the sort of urban scale we're talking about, urban scale buildings. Yeah, and each of these are specific cases. So that's why it feels like to go into detail at this point would be a little bit meaningless, because the detail on the next contract would be different.
Okay, and then still in the general conditions, again, kind of like need for insurance and procedures for resolving disputes, and we'll have a kind of a special lecture podcast on that. And then ways that you can end the contract. The most common way of ending a contract is by completing it. But there are other ways of ending a contract, such as the death of a contractor, and then all sorts of things in between.
So this is again from the NZAS document and ACS document, and they're really good at showing you where all the pitfalls happen, and hopefully try to catch you before you fall down one of them. So obviously there are some difficulties around the client-architect relationship, where the client is not actually, the client that you're dealing with on the day-to-day basis is not actually your client. The person who pays the bills is your client. So for example, if you're doing a library and the client is the Auckland City Council, but you don't deal with the Auckland City Council, you will be dealing probably on a day-to-day basis with the library, the people who want to establish, are going to be moving in to the building. And the same thing again, the user group is not, you're not even dealing with the user group. So the general public are the user group, and you don't get to deal with them at all. So in fact, you deal with a middle group who is your client, because they're the people that answer your questions in terms of brief and design, but they're not paying your bills. So what can happen is sometimes the client you deal with on a daily basis tells you one thing, and the people paying your bills tell you something else. And you have to be really clear about which one, and ultimately you have to be guided by.
I like the one that's number 5 down. Has the client signed the fee proposal terms and conditions? Because you put all this effort into putting the contract together, you explain it to the client says, sure, I'll take it off and show it to my lawyer, or discuss it with my partner or something like that. Meanwhile, a few days go past, you carry on doing the design work, etc., etc., etc. And then after quite some time, you could go, gosh, we don't actually have a signed contract between us.
Yeah, that's really common. People forget and get excited, until something bad happens. Yeah, so And then there's another one down there too. Does New Zealand law and jurisdiction apply? Well, you know, quite often we're doing projects that are overseas, and we might be doing them remotely. So, are the laws that we that guide us here, do they apply to the new project? Quite often they'll be different laws.
Yeah. And then one of the good things that professional organisations do, and the Institute of Architects does it, is they give guidance letters, and these come out quite regularly. And you know, you have a look through these, and they can be just talking about changes in law, either through acts of parliament or case law, decisions in court, or it could be issues that where an architect has got in trouble. So these are just examples of guide letters that come out and constantly give you guidance on what's happening in the world of contracts.
So there, for example, in the first one, expenditure additional to the agreed fees. So really, really common. You sign the agreement for fees, AAS, right at the beginning. You're doing everything right, and during the course of the design process and even the documentation process, the client might be expanding the brief. So they may be adding in rooms or other things that they want in their building. Well, actually, with the expansion of the brief and the expansion of the building and the cost of the building, the architectural fees should go up because there's additional work being asked for. So you're now in the position where you have to write them a letter and tell them that. And how do you phrase that? Because they think that they've got this fixed fee. So there's a guide letter there that helps you put the language clearly to the client in relation to the original agreement. That's actually our last slide.
So normally, we in the old normal, we'd break at this point. You'd have some biscuits and some fruit or something like that, and chat about these things in little groups. But we've left this image in here as some of the key points that you can reflect on before you go to the next podcast.
Yeah, just to highlight again the main points of this particular session, and see if you can think of about a few questions that you might ask the panel in the panel Zoom meeting. This is where we will meet you again next. So we'll start again on podcast number 7 and the architect's fees. So
this is the last one of the cluster of 4 that you need to listen to and have a look at before, so that you're well informed when you're asking questions of the next live panel.
Yes, which is on the 30th of March, panel 2 on the 30th of March, but we'll explain that again in number 7. Thank you.